Dr. Y here, and this afternoon I'm going to review some tips for great presentations. I did this presentation originally over at UC San Diego for the Rady Mini MBA program, and really actually made a major impact on the teams that were doing their final presentations. They went from really a week beforehand really having not very clear presentations to some really very fine presentations. I also use this with my marketing management MBAs as well as my Business 454 students as well. So I'm going to share this as well for the Rutgers Industry Fellowship Fellows. I think there's some pearls that'll help you get ahead, especially when you're trying to make an impact with executives at your organizations. So, first question I always put forth is, what do people fear more than death itself? Believe it or not, it is presentations. Presentations are like either 1, 2, or 3 in terms of the greatest fears that people have. Furthermore is, do you ever feel like you just missed getting your point, or you feel like you made your point? And this is very, very critical with your audience, that you're able to make your points up front, which is presentation will help you a whole lot in terms of doing that, which is critical with executive audiences. And last but not least, by doing this, it's very important because, you got to keep the attention of your executives. If not, you're going to get a big yawn. In fact, if you don't get them in the first 30 seconds, no later than 2 minutes, forget about it. You're lost. And it's not unusual to see executives tune out on their phones or to leave a presentation, and you're waiting maybe 30 minutes later to make your bottom line point. So hopefully we can help you get a little sharper in terms of with your arrows to be able to make your point and to be able to eliminate the yawn factor. So what makes for great presentations? Okay, I have 3 things. I'm going to start with setup. I'm going to move to a pyramid, which is based on Barbara Minto's pyramid in terms of clarity of communication. And then last but not least, some tips and examples that will help you with your PowerPoints. So what makes for a great setup? A great setup is with a hook. In fact, on Friday, we were working with the Rutgers fellow. One of the things that I noticed was that one of the fellows started with a hook like, "What time is it?" And then people go, "I don't know what time it is." And they went, "Chat Tracy," and really enthusiastic and got us hooked into the presentation we want to do. So there are different types of hooks. I like to use stories or questions. Sometimes you use a misdirect or a joke. Sometimes use a metaphor, or as you saw, I used a few examples that were there to sort of ring home, or something shocking or provocative. I know Bill Gates did in a TED Talk where he released a group of flies, mosquitoes actually, that had a virus, he said. So that got a lot of people's attention. So always think about how are you going to connect your audience up front so they have something of interest to stay with you. For instance, here, I used this in our SEO lecture last year in terms of strap in for Fast and Furious review. Or we used this last summer over in a presentation at Berkeley in terms of using Simon Sinek's Start With Why. Some know how they do it, some know their why, but CBSY could be the competitive advantage. So, this is ways of being able to hook the audience in. Second of all is, once you get a hook going, you really need to do a good setup. And crafting a good story, which is critical to great presentations, is with the setup. If you set the frame properly, then your audience knows where you're going to go. And usually what we use is an acronym called SCQR, which is Situation, Complication, Question, and Resolution or Recommendations. Okay, and that actually comes from Barbara Minto of McKinsey. So here's SEQR analysis that one of my Business 454 teams did. In fact, they were one of the highest scoring teams, where they set up the situation of what was going on with a winery that they were consulting with, what the complication was, which stagnant sales, which is not unusual in business where they bring consultants in. And then the goal is, question is, how do we increase sales or shift things? And then their particular recommendation in terms of brand awareness. So when you do that, you set it up, you need to think about, okay, your recommendation, but with your recommendation, you need to think in 3s or 4s in terms of breaking your presentation into those buckets. And what you do is you have 3 or 4 buckets which are supporting your core recommendation. So that I'm going to use that to segue into the pyramid principle that Barbara Minto from McKinsey has really advocated and developed, and I think it'll be very helpful. In fact, we do this a lot when we write in terms of dividing out things into 3 argument paragraphs. So how should you organize your presentations, or how do you do it? Well, according to Minto, a great story is done by using what we call the pyramid principle, and that is by taking your ideas and really grouping them together in common areas and making it logical in terms of how they fit into the groups, but also how the groups fit together. And then last but not least, good old MECE, which is mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. So let's look at this, of all things, a grocery list, okay? Looks like a lot of stuff to remember, but believe it or not, if you remember the major categories, guess what? You can remember this grocery list. And boy, my wife would really love that. Okay, I always forget something. So if I broke it down into, 3 or 4 categories. So let's see what kind of categories do we have here. It looks like we have some dairy. Looks like we have some vegetables. Looks like dry goods. And also it looks like some fruit. Let's see what we net out with. Oh, great. We've just broken that long list into 4 buckets. Now I can remember those things within the buckets much more easily. The same thing goes in terms of making your points with the audience, because they remember in 3s to 4s. So if you can hit the major points and have your support points underneath, your story becomes much more logical and cogent. So this concept of MECE follows to this, which is mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. So it's a way of organizing your thought process. And some of you may be familiar with what we call a decision tree or an issues tree. Well, in many ways, MECE follows that rule in terms of, for mutually exclusive, do any points overlap? And collectively exhaustive is that we've covered all the possibilities. So let's give an example. It's a marketing example here. Being a marketing person, it's like increased sales. That we get many clients who come in with that. So there are 3 different ways you could attack that. Okay, you could change the sales strategy or the implementation side, which you can break down further relative to organization, skill base, and promotion strategy. Or you can improve the marketing strategy in terms of relative to the 4 Ps, the product quality, packaging, and promotion, which is the consumer advertising strategy. Or you could go to the 4th P, which is pricing, and say reduce product unit costs, and then some of the drivers around the cost, such as raw materials, production process, and distribution, which gets to actually the cost of goods sold. So this way you can really drive it out in terms of really building out a cogent argument. Another one relevant that I come up with many times is sales are down. Okay, well, let's break that down into 3 buckets. And bucket number 1 is that the market, something's happened in the market's constrained. Second bucket could be something's happened with your competition, that they're taking your business. The competition has taken an advantage somewhere, and as a result, they're doing something that is grabbing market share. The third is maybe there's something that you are doing or not doing that one either has offended the customer, that they're going to competition or staying with the status quo, or that you've not been as compelling as you want to have, or that you're not doing to address their needs, and as a result don't feel the need to be able to be serviced by you or your products or your organization. So those are some things to start thinking about as you approach your consulting assignments, but also as you make your presentations. So what about this thing called flow? And this flow is very important because it really provides a logic in terms of how you should be able to present out your presentations. So The flow for presentations are different from what we call the scientific problem-solving approach or analysis. So the problem-solving process usually starts with identification, hypothesis, data, conclusions, recommendations. In contrast, the presentation process starts with the problem statement or the situation, complication, question, and then the core recommendations, okay? And then with those recommendations come your conclusions, which are your buckets and the data that are there. So it's sort of like taking the end of the movie and presenting it at the beginning. And I think it's actually quite valuable because sometimes the executives who come into a presentation may only have 5-10 minutes to sit through. And if you haven't made that point and you wait 30 minutes to make your bottom line recommendations, you may have had a lost opportunity. So this is a very critical slide. This is something that in B54, 454, guys, you got to remember to use this. The folks in the mini MBA used this and did a great job, which there's really 3 hooks to remember. One is your setup, which is your SEQR, and you have your 3 strategies. Your backup, which are basically your argument points. So your 3 to 4 buckets. Recommendation 1, 2, 3. So when I see your presentations, they should try to flow out of there. And then your wrap up, which is steps forward, risk and mitigation, take home, final point. So I'm going to stop here for a second and just say, guess what? If I had an exam, this would be on the final exam. Okay? So every rubric that we will have in 454, I'll be looking at this flow. So make this indelible, structure your presentations around it, you'll be a winner. Also, for those who are not in 454, this is definitely going to be something that will help you make much more effective presentations. Quote Bill Barton, who's the CEO of California Closets, every of my teams that have used this format have been able to make a very effective presentation to him and his senior executives who are at the VP level. So, now we get into the last area, tips and examples. Okay, and these are just tips to help you with your PowerPoints and your presentations. These are things that I've taken from various presentations in the past and learnings that I've had as well. So, one is headlines, and there is an article by Michael Alley that studied headlines. So headlines are important because they tell a story, and if you link them together, you really can put together a very compelling story. But with headlines, believe it or not, as Ali has pointed out, is that the recall in terms of a singular headline that doesn't really tell a story, you get maybe less than 50% recall, and this is a study that they did. Whereas, alternatively, by having specific descriptive headline, the recall for the story was that much higher. Fact, when you have a deck and you have headlines and you have executives, if they can go through the headlines, they can scan that deck in about 30 seconds to 2 minutes and get the bottom line. And that's really the point here is you want to be effective that even if they don't go into the details, they can go through the top line of the headline so that they can get a sense of your story and what you're trying to make as your point. All right, and here's the data that supports what Ali found, which basically was that sentence-heavy presentations led to higher test scores. Okay, so from a teacher standpoint, if you notice in some of my presentations, they use a headline. And that's because I want you to make sure that some of this stuff sticks with you. And then you got to link them together as a story. So this is a story that is The Boys in the Boat. I'm not going to go through it, but it's a great book. Should be a movie. It is something that basically compels you with a exposition setting up in terms of our protagonists, and then the journey in terms of moving forward to get to the Olympics, going against the competition, ultimately going into the Olympics, and then at the climax of the final in terms of the sculling finals versus Germany and Italy, being able to pull it out, and then the falling of tension and the resolution in terms of this relationship of these winners and the accolades they got and the relationships that they took to 30, 40 years later. So think about a story, and there are a lot of different stories, like Boys Meets Girl is another good. That's Romeo and Juliet, for instance. But it should try to tie to what we call a story arc. So cheat sheets for better slide decks. So I've already talked about takeaway message, so every slide should have a takeaway. Okay, self-explanatory. So use tables, charts, graphs, word art. You see I use a lot of that. And if text, like I broke it up here, I put it into a box or with animations and break it up a little bit. And have builds and call-outs for complex slides and section anchors for transitions and transition slides. As you've seen, I've had some transition slides. Also be consistent. Make sure your font and background. Okay, I've run into this a lot of times where there are contrast issues and makes it difficult to read. Make sure you're consistent throughout in terms of the font that you use, even the headings. When you have your headings, that if they're all first letter capitalized, they be all first letter capitalized, that they be the same font, ideally the same font size. Make sure that you have references in the lower left-hand corner, so they're clear. Usually about 10 or 11 point is fine, and page numbers in the lower right-hand corner. Make sure you check for typos and grammar, and have an appendix, which we'll talk a little bit later on about having with titles and page numbers. So here's an example of just a setup, and this is with a story. It was actually some market research. It was actually a 45-page PowerPoint that we had done as a team for debriefing market research that we had done relative to immigrant entrepreneurs, but we built it around a story that was basically the road trip or the roadmap to what we did for our research. Okay, and we had what we call stop-off points. So here's the headline, we have a story arc, and we have a page number. Here's another example that we used for actually University of Tokyo to really just hook in 3 elements that people should remember relative to doing a what we call investor pitch. Set up, deliver the value proposition, make the call for investment. Notice how I use smart art and color contrast, but smart art rather than just pure bullets. And the page number. Here's something that one of our teams did for cybersecurity. Okay, and what they did, as you can see, they have the references, they have the page number, and they do this with actually a build in terms of the data, but some key call-out data, and then see the section anchor and the headline. Here's another team that worked with California Closets, which did really nice setup in terms of SCQR. They had some nice smart art to be able to lay out the SCQR, so it's not a boring bullet point. They included a page number, and as you see on the bottom, they had section anchors, which help you know where you're at and where you're going. On recommendations, the same team, we're able to lay out the 3 recommendations using smart art, and what I like is they have specifically a nice headline, and they included the anchors. Another California Closets team that worked with our 454 class had a section anchor, headline. As you can see, they had smart art, as you could see, in terms of the textual content, but they used icons to really highlight and emphasize some aspects of that, such as a buy for the market, a website with a computer, and garage openings in terms of the ticket to the industry. So I think a very clever way of being able to display information. And then you get to something that our team from Berkeley did, which we had a very complicated SWOT analysis. And what's interesting is a lot of folks do a SWOT analysis. Let's spend 3-4 minutes on a SWOT analysis. And yet, the bottom line is that you probably have 1 or 2 key points out of your SWOT analysis that is your take-home. So you could see the take-home headline summary that we used, included our references. We didn't overdo our bullets, but we put them into nice boxes. And as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, we had what we call section anchors. And then for implementation plan, what we did, and this is important for the teams going forward, you're going to be having to put an implementation plan. What's next to accomplish? So lay out your tasks, who's responsible, and when they're due. It's something that I will be evaluating the students as they move forward in their engagements. So Q&A. Q&A will make or break you. Okay, so here's some tips on Q&A. First of all, don't be defensive. Can you be coachable? Can you take in some things? Don't have 3 people answering the question. Use nonverbal signals to indicate that you're open for the Q&A. Sometimes you need to repeat the question or flip it back so that you can buy time, but also so you understand the question. We've had with several of our teams where we come out with questions to break the ice. And then use an appendix, because you may have some great data and you've anticipated questions as your opportunity to be able to highlight the data to emphasize that you've done your research and you've anticipated those questions. And last but not least, as I said beforehand, and it drives me crazy when the answer is really very succinct, and I'll have 4 people answer that, and they'll waste 2 minutes, and it's disrespectful to the audience, because the audience probably wants to ask more questions. So, anticipate questions within your appendix, options considered but not rejected, sensitivity analysis and contingency plans, such as risk and mitigation, basic supporting analysis. We have the risk and mitigation, elaborate on recommendations or implementation plans, and strategy points. These are just a few examples, but these are things that you should start thinking about, especially if you've done a lot of research, to have there. Okay, you may have core 10 that'll get you through 10 minutes or 8 minutes of a presentation, but you may end up having another 15 slides, and I've had folks who have done a ton of research and for their presentation have 50 backup slides to show their research, so that in the Q&A, if something comes up, they can respond. A great case example of this was one of our teams, which worked with a company called Omeza. They knew that one of the questions was going to get to distribution and distribution model. And what was interesting was, as we talked about it, because we really focused the team on really advocating in terms of developing opinion leader support or our thought leader support within the medical community for venous leg ulcer. However, we knew that the client was going to ask a question about distribution. So we had built in there in terms of an alternate distribution model, which would basically be, basically a E-based distribution model that would drop ship standard amount of supply every month that would be on a subscription model. So they had it there. And guess what? The question came as the third question. This came from, actually, if anybody, it was the chief technical officer. The great thing about it is, one of the gals who was on that team, her name was Lucy Robeson, and in a sweet English accent, goes, "I'm glad you asked that question, because we thought about that too." Flip to the slide, you could see Chip Bettle's jaw just drop. Well done, Lucy. And that's what we hope that you guys will be able to do, to be able to impress your clients and make your points. Okay, so add and organize an appendix. Okay, think through and have an appendix and make sure they're hyperlinked. So in this case, you see we have, this was our CVS team that worked with, and you could see what the items that we had there. But notice that on the slide number, there's a little line underneath. That means that we've hyperlinked it to the slide, and we've relinked the slide when we get to the data back to the appendix table of contents. That's really best case in terms of really how to toggle back and forth. I do this technique when I build slide sets for companies for their MSLs, so that they can be able to move through their data back and forth very easily. And then also have some icebreaker questions. This we used for our Berkeley presentation dealing with CVS pharmacy. So having some questions to really be provocative, but also to break the ice. And so how to wrap up a presentation, as I'm coming up to the time that you guys are going to pull the hook on me. Okay? So first, make sure you have a memorable close. For instance, in this, which was in our McKinsey presentation, which dealt with the McKinsey engagement, and we talked about basically team and focus, it raised home, really, did you want to make the journey ordinary or extraordinary? In my SEO lecture that I did last year, I pointed out in terms of the need to be able to constantly be dynamic and growing and changing, since to improve SEO, you have to be dynamic, you have to be hyperlinking back and forth, and you have to be constantly changing your content. I found this quote from our ex-governor, Arnie Schwarzenegger, and if you think about it, he's constantly been reinventing himself and changing, and his quote is, either you grow or you regress, and nothing stands still. And that's so true in social media. And then last but not least, this parting shot. Remember a call to action. So at this one, we have ready to rip. So I think I've covered some of the major things under 25 minutes. Hopefully this will give you a sense of some tips that can help you really rev up your presentations, make your point, impress your audience, and at the end of the day, really stand out. thanks a lot for your time, and I look forward to your questions and seeing your presentations in the future.